Welcome to the Paul Chandler Show, everyone. I'm your host, Paul Chandler. In tonight's episode, we're going to learn how to code fracture repairs in the musculoskeletal system. Because even though we have the 206 bones in our body, there's still only 3 simple formats on how we code for the fracture repair. So stay tuned, and we'll be right back, and we'll learn how to code fractures in the musculoskeletal system for procedure coding. Welcome back, everybody. So tonight we're going to look at how we code fractures for the musculoskeletal system, as in the fracture repairs. Now, the thing is though, yes, there's 206 bones in our body. However, though, there's not 206 different ways how we fix fractures. Each fracture repair that we have as far as the treatment only has 3 different types. So we're going to look at, for example, let's say code 21310. So if we look up that CPT code, CPT 21310, we have close treatment of nasal bone fracture without manipulation. So no matter what bone is actually having the fracture repaired, all of the bones in the musculoskeletal system, get 206, have the same format, the 3 different steps that we need. And if you watched the show before, or have been in any of our classes with Ohana coding, you know that I use the phrase this, comma, this, comma, this. So looking back in at that code 21310, our first is for the fractures is the type of treatment or the treatment type. So with the treatment type, there are 3 different ways that a provider can have the treatment. So I'm just going to jot over here fractures because that's what we're doing today. So there's, again, the 3 different ways how a treatment type can be performed. I'm just going to put on the first letter here, but the types that we have are closed, open, or percutaneous. Just remember, COP. Closed treatment, in that case the skin is still intact and the provider is able to treat the fracture and fix the fracture without having to open up the skin. So with that case, the patient comes in with a closed fracture. So for example, let's say my arm here is fractured. This blue marker is my fractured bone. You can't see it, mother's behind it, and the doctor can fix the fracture. Although sometimes though, that the patient may come up with a closed fracture, but you know what, maybe it's towards your elbow or towards your wrist, somewhere near a joint, even though it's a closed fracture when the patient comes in, then the doctor may decide, you know what, I'm gonna cut open the skin so I can visually look at the bone to fix it. In that case, the provider would have a closed fracture for the patient, but it'd be an open treatment instead. So the doctor can actually see the bone. The other type we have is percutaneous treatment. Think of percutaneous as the provider is putting in a pin or a screw or rod. Something metal is going into the patient to be able to fix the fracture. So the first type of this, comma, this, comma, this variable is always the treatment type. Now if a patient comes in with an open fracture, so let's say the blue marker is a fractured bone, okay, yep, you can see the fracture, and we're never going to have a closed treatment in that case because the provider is not going to push the bone back down, not fix it yet, but just push the bone back down and then close the skin and then start fixing the bone. If that ever happens, get a good lawyer and get a new doctor. So you can have a closed treatment being performed on a closed fracture. So again, patient comes in with a closed fracture, you can have a closed treatment. Patient comes in with a closed fracture, you can have an open treatment if the doctor decides to physically cut open the skin, or the open fracture can be the open treatment. Now all of them, no matter what it is, can also be the percutaneous treatment. But regardless though, that's the first out of the 3 variables, every location in the musculoskeletal system. So first we have to know what is the type of treatment. And then the second variable is the where. Where specifically is that bone that the patient has fracture that's being treated. And even though we have, again, 206 bones in our body, we have many different bones that we have, but the treatment's all still the same. Now in the CPT book, how it's divided based on the anatomy is the red headers will either have a generic area For example, if I shoot a point to your head bone, for example, right now, point to your head bone. And please say you're not pointing to your head, because that's not a head bone. We have multiple bones in our head that fuse together for the skull and mandible, the joint. So if you're pointing to your head, gotcha. Generic areas. Other parts of the CPT book, musculoskeletal system section, it's by specific bone. So where are we doing it at? As far as, for example, in code 21310, nasal bone fracture. So dealing with the nose. And then the third variable, and I just use this as a catch-all because it could be one of many, many different things. So I just put in the phrase anything else. As in, did the doctor do anything else or anything else notated? For example, if dealing with the nose area, dealing with the eyes, what's the approach that the doctor went in? Did the doctor do manipulation or not? Or stabilization? Now the difference, because they both end in ation, manipulation, the doctor's using his or her manually applied hands, manually applied forces. They're using their hands to fix the fracture. Now what I do not mean by that is, so you remember the 3 movies from the 1980s, the Karate Kid movies, 1, 2, and 3? Let's just say that, I forgot what year it was, but 15 or so years ago, there was an attempt at a remake. Let's pretend that one was never made, because it wasn't. And we're just talking about the 3 ones from the 80s. So, remember Mr. Miyagi and Daniel, the Karate Kid person, Ralph Macchio? That's, you really don't want me to do that, but kind of hard to do that movement in a suit. But with Mr. Miyagi, and then, okay, Daniel-san, you're fixed now. That's not what we mean by manipulation using your hands. Manipulation would mean you're actually manipulating, so the doctor has to push the bone back to where it needs to go. That's what we mean by manipulation. So manipulation means that the bone is going back where it's supposed to go. Stabilization means that the doctor is not fixing the location, not putting it back where it's supposed to go, but just keeping it still so it doesn't get any worse. Those are some variables that we have. Is the doctor putting an implant in or bone graft? And nothing in there. So that's why I do, as far as the third item, the third this, simply just anything else as a catch-all. So you can look through the musculoskeletal system, if you'd like, in the fracture section, fracture/slash dislocation, and seeing how, no matter what the red header is for the location, all the fracture codes always have 3 variables that we need. This, comma, this, comma, this. Variable number 1, what type of treatment is the provider providing for the patient? Closed, open, or percutaneous? Number 2, where specifically is that fracture at? And number 3, did they do anything else? Or is anything else notated? Is the approach an issue in there? Or I should say a factor. Or did they do manipulation, stabilization, a bone graft, an implant, or anything else in there? So you see that it's quite simplistic. Once you break down the variables of the 3 variables that we have for coding fractures for the musculoskeletal system, and just remember how it's carbon copied throughout. So no matter what section of the CPT book, it's the same format. So all fracture dislocation repairs need all 3 variables in the musculoskeletal system. I do thank you for watching this episode of the Paul Chandler Show, and have an awesome rest of your night. If you like this video and want to see more, make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's so easy. It's right there. A little button. Just push it. Subscribe. I got all night. Nothing else to do. Just subscribe.